Alix, remembered by history as Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, the last Tsarina of Russia. She was born into one of the most celebrated royal families in Europe, a granddaughter of the woman they called the grandmother of nations. From the very beginning, her life seemed to promise warmth, beauty, and belonging. And for a few brief golden years in the nurseries of Darmstadt, it truly did. Then loss arrived early and without mercy, and the sunny little girl, who had laughed through those German summers, slowly became someone quieter, someone who searched the world for a place she could truly call home. She found it, at last, in a man she had loved for nearly a decade, and in a faith she had embraced with her whole heart. She became an empress, she became a mother, and she was misunderstood at almost every turn. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have only just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here, as always. Tonight, make yourself comfortable. Lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm and complete story of Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, born Princess Alix of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and the last woman to hold the title of Tsarina of Russia. Hers is a story that moves from the sunny nurseries of a German palace through the glittering halls of the Russian Imperial court into the shadows of a revolution that shook the world, and ends at last, not in darkness, but in the quiet light of sainthood. We will softly explore every chapter of her remarkable life, from her earliest days in Darmstadt to the love story that held firm even through captivity, and finally to the legacy that history has spent more than a century slowly learning to understand, all told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which chapter of Alexandra's life moved you most will help keep these stories coming. The story of Alexandra Feodorovna, the last empress of Russia, begins not in the golden halls of the Winter Palace, not on the frozen plains of a vast empire, but in a modest German palace in the Duchy of Hesse, in a household that, despite its royal name, was in many ways a warm and ordinary family home. She was born on the 6th of June, 1872, at the New Palace in Darmstadt, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse and by Rhine, which at that time formed part of the German Empire. She was given the names Alix Victoria Helene Louise Beatrix, or in the English form used by her British relatives, Alice Victoria Helena Louise Beatrice. In the family, she was called simply Alix, and from the very beginning, she was called something else as well, something warmer. Her mother gave her the nickname Sunny. It suited her perfectly. Her mother was Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, the second daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Alice was a woman of considerable intelligence and warmth, someone who had grown up in the heart of the most powerful royal family in the world, and who had carried that sense of purpose and thoughtfulness into her life in Hesse. Her father was Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and by Rhine, a kind and relatively gentle man who would later succeed to the formal title of Grand Duke. Together, Alice and Louis had built a family, a large, lively one, with rooms full of children, and the particular cheerful noise that comes when several young people share a household. Alix was the sixth of their 7 children. Above her, in the family order, came her eldest sister Victoria, then Ella, whose full name was Elizabeth, then Irene, then her brother Ernst Ludwig, and then Friedrich, the second son, who was known in the family as Fritti. Below Alix came the youngest, a little girl named Marie, but known by the family nickname May. Between Alix and May, there was a bond that even the other siblings noticed. The two youngest girls were close companions from the beginning, dressed alike, sharing a nursery, rarely separated. Life in Darmstadt was not the life of the grand imperial courts that Alix would one day inhabit. The household was comfortable rather than extravagant, and Princess Alice made a deliberate effort to raise her children simply. She had been influenced by progressive ideas about education and nursing. She had corresponded with Florence Nightingale and held a genuine belief that women could and should be educated, that they should understand the world around them, and that privileged upbringing was no excuse for ignorance or idleness. She taught her children herself in many subjects. She insisted that they understand something of ordinary life, and she brought to Darmstadt a style of motherhood that was unusually warm and hands-on for the royalty of her era. She nursed her own children, played with them in the gardens, and kept the household grounded even within its palace walls. For Alix, those early years were genuinely golden. She was a lively child with bright eyes and a disposition that matched her nickname entirely. Those who knew her then remembered a girl who laughed easily, who ran freely through the gardens of the new palace, who was curious and mischievous and full of energy. Her mother watched her with particular delight. There was something in Alix that her mother seemed to recognize and cherish, a brightness of spirit that set her apart even in a household of bright children. And then, of course, there were the visits to England. Because Alice was Queen Victoria's daughter, the Hesse children were connected at every level to the great web of British royal life. Queen Victoria herself was a constant presence in their lives, not physically present in Darmstadt, but corresponding regularly with their mother, and welcoming the family to England whenever circumstances allowed. The Queen was known to be fond of all her grandchildren, but she had a particular warmth for Alix. She called her Alexei, a nickname used by the British side of the family to distinguish her from her Aunt Alexandra, the Princess of Wales, who had married the future King Edward VII. Queen Victoria is said to have declared that young Alix was the most beautiful child she had ever seen. For a woman not given to easy flattery even about her own descendants, that was a striking thing to say. The world of Hesse itself was a quiet one in those years. It was part of the new German Empire that had been proclaimed in 1871, just the year before Alix's birth, a political arrangement that gave the various German states a unified structure under Prussian leadership, while allowing the individual duchies and grand duchies to maintain their own identities and institutions. Darmstadt was a city of modest size, shaped by its history as a ducal seat, and the new palace where Alix grew up sat at the center of that small but dignified world. By the standards of great European courts, it was a quiet posting, and in many ways that quiet was a gift. It gave the children room to be children in a way that the great palaces of Russia or Britain rarely allowed. But within the household itself, there had already been grief. Before Alix could properly register it, the family had already known loss. Her elder brother Friedrich, Fritti, the boy who was only 2 years older than Alix, had suffered from the very beginning with a condition that was recognized but imperfectly understood in that era. His blood would not clot properly. The smallest cut could become a crisis. And in May of 1873, when Fritti was only 2 years old, he had climbed up near an open window, and the chair he had been standing on had shifted, and he had fallen onto the balustrade below. He survived the immediate fall, but the brain hemorrhage that followed was something his small body could not overcome. He died that same day. He was not quite 3 years old. Alix was not yet 1. She would not have known Fritti. She was too young to hold the memory. But the grief of that loss shaped the household she grew into, shaped her mother especially, who carried the weight of it for years. Princess Alice had watched her little son die and had understood, with the quiet clarity that grief sometimes brings, that she had passed something to him that she could not help, that she had given him life and with it, an invisible flaw that had taken that life away. It was a knowledge that never fully left her. But life continued in Darmstadt. Children were resilient, as children always are, and the household found its rhythm again. Alex grew and May grew below her, and the sisters played together in the gardens and the nursery rooms with all the ordinary intensity of childhood friendship. Alex was devoted to her little sister. The two girls, just 2 years apart in age, were described as making a pretty contrast, one fair, one slightly darker, and their mother watched them with quiet happiness. It was in the autumn of 1878 that the happiness broke. The illness came into the household, the way that diphtheria so often did in that era. Quietly at first, with a sore throat, a fever, a membrane beginning to form in the throat that would eventually thicken, until breathing became difficult. Diphtheria was one of the great killers of the 19th century, and it moved through households and communities with a speed that left little time for preparation. In November of 1878, the eldest daughter Victoria fell ill first. Her fever was high, and when the family physician was summoned, he found that white membrane on both sides of her throat that was the unmistakable sign of what they were dealing with. Princess Alice sent a telegram to Queen Victoria, informing her that Victoria had diphtheria, and within days, one after another, the children began to follow. Alex herself fell sick on the 10th of November. Her mother sent another desperate telegram to the Queen, reporting that her little Alex was terribly ill and that it seemed she might die. Then the other children came down one by one, until only Ella remained unaffected. She was moved out of the infected rooms and kept separate, while her mother nursed the rest of the household with a calm determination that those who observed it found remarkable. The house was a sick house now. Every room had its patient, its particular schedule of fevers and recoveries, its particular demands on the woman who was trying to hold everything together. Princess Alice moved between them, monitoring temperatures, managing medications, speaking to the doctors, keeping the household staff organized and as calm as circumstances allowed. She carried within her, through all of this, a constant anxiety that she expressed in letters to her mother, but managed within the walls of the new palace to keep largely hidden from those around her. And then May died. Little May, Marie, the youngest, the constant companion of Alex's nursery days, was only 4 years old. She had been among the sickest of the children, and she did not recover. Alice sat with her through the final hours, and when it was over, she faced a terrible decision: how to carry this knowledge in a house where the other children were still fighting their way through the illness, still needing care and steadiness, and the particular reassurance that only a present and composed mother could provide. She made the decision that any mother in that situation might have made. She kept the secret. She continued her rounds. She maintained the composure that her children needed from her, while inside she was carrying a grief that had no outlet. But the secret could not be kept forever. It was Ernst Ludwig, 12 years old, and still recovering from his own illness, who eventually asked where his little sister was. He had been noticing her absence, and the explanations that had been offered were wearing thin. Alice, who had been holding herself together with a strength that was borrowed from somewhere she could not name, finally broke. She reached out to her son and held him and wept. She kissed him. She comforted him the way a mother does when words are not enough. And in that moment, that entirely human, entirely understandable moment of grief giving way to physical comfort, she made a mistake that she did not know she was making. She had been nursing diphtheria patients for weeks, She had been careful, but in the unguarded moment of that embrace, she was not careful, and the disease found its way into her own body. The membrane began to form in her throat, just as it had in her children's throats, just as May's had, just as Victoria's had been at the beginning of it all. Princess Alice died on the 14th of December, 1878. She was 35 years old. It was by one of those coincidences that seemed too precise for the randomness of grief to generate, the same date on which her own father, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved consort, had died 17 years before. Mother and daughter, separated by a generation, dying on the same December day. Alix was 6 years old. What a 6-year-old understands about death is limited, and what she retains from a winter of illness and the absence of the two people, her sister and her mother, who had filled the warmest parts of her world, is not necessarily memory in the way that adults experience memory. It is something more like atmosphere, a change in the quality of everything. The people who had been there and then were not there. The toys that were burned because of contamination fears. The quieter household. The father who was trying his best, but who had never been the parent who held things together in the way that Alice had. The sense, absorbed at the level of childhood feeling rather than conscious thought, that the world could take the people you loved without warning and without fairness. That sense never left her. And those who understood Alexandra Feodorovna best, who looked past the reputation and into the person, often traced much of who she became back to this winter. The ferocious attachment to those she loved, the difficulty trusting people she did not know, the intensity of her faith, the willingness, when she needed to be, to stand against enormous pressure rather than abandon a conviction, the fear, always just beneath the surface, that she might lose the people most precious to her. A 6-year-old who loses her mother and her closest sister in the same December carries something into every subsequent year that shapes her in ways she herself may not have been able fully to name. When Princess Alice died in December of 1878, she left behind a husband and 5 surviving children in a palace that had become very quiet. The eldest, Victoria, was 15. The youngest, Alix, was 6. They had lost in the space of weeks their little sister May, and now their mother, and the household that had been shaped so carefully by Alice's warm and purposeful presence was suddenly without the person who had held it all together. Queen Victoria acted quickly. She insisted that the children and their father come to England as soon as they were well enough to travel, so that she could offer what comfort she could. The Queen was herself no stranger to grief. She had lost Prince Albert in 1861, and had spent much of the intervening years in a state of mourning that the public had at times found excessive, and that she had never fully abandoned. She understood something about loss that perhaps only those who have experienced it deeply can understand. And she gathered the Hesse children around her with the particular attention of a grandmother who knew what they were entering. For Alix, the years that followed were marked by a gentle kind of duality. She still lived in Darmstadt with her father and her siblings because that was their home, and Louis IV continued to lead the household as Grand Duke, but visits to England became more frequent and more significant. The Isle of Wight, where Victoria maintained her beloved Osborne house, became a second world for Alix, a world of English gardens and English habits, and a grandmother who doted on her with an unusual intensity. Victoria called Alix her favourite grandchild, which was a significant statement from a woman who had dozens of them. The attachment was genuine and mutual. Alix grew up, therefore, in a space between two cultures. She was German by nationality and residence, born in Darmstadt, educated there, surrounded by the rhythms of German court life, but she was English by formation in many of the ways that mattered most to her inner life. She spoke English with the ease and naturalness of a first language. She read English literature. She absorbed English habits of mind. Queen Victoria corresponded with her regularly as she grew older, offering the kind of frank and personal advice that a grandmother might offer, and watching with close attention as the girl became a young woman. Those who knew Alix in her childhood and adolescence described a personality that had been changed by what she had endured. The sunny nickname lingered, but those who looked more carefully noticed that the sunniness now sat alongside something quieter, a thoughtfulness, a tendency to withdraw, a depth of feeling that the early losses had given her. She was still capable of laughter and warmth with those she trusted, but she had learned, at an age when most children are still discovering the world, that the people you love most can disappear without warning. That knowledge made her hold those she loved more tightly, and it made her slower to extend trust beyond the circle of those she was certain of. Her faith deepened in these years as well. The Hesse family was Lutheran, and Alix had been baptized and raised in that tradition. But something in her gravitated toward the interior, the contemplative, the mystical, toward a kind of religion that was not simply a matter of attendance and form, but a genuine internal relationship with God. The members of the House of Hesse, it was noted by those who observed them closely, had a tendency across generations toward a kind of religious intensity that bordered on mysticism. Alex's elder sister Ella would one day become a Russian Orthodox nun and found a convent in Moscow. In Alix herself, the same quality was present from early on, a faith that was not simply inherited but genuinely felt, and that would shape every important decision of her life. She was educated well, she had governesses, and she applied herself to her studies with the seriousness that her mother had modelled. Languages came relatively naturally. She was fluent in English and German, and would later acquire Russian. Though she never entirely lost her foreign accent, she was musical, as many of the women in her family were. She was artistically inclined, and as she moved through adolescence, it became clear to everyone who saw her that she had also grown into a striking beauty, tall, fair, with a quality of presence that caught attention wherever she went. Queen Victoria noticed, as grandmothers do, that her Alexei was becoming a young woman who would attract royal suitors, and the Queen, who had spent decades thinking about the strategic marriages of her grandchildren across the royal houses of Europe, began to consider what the future might hold for Alix. One possibility that the Queen had in mind was a match with Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, who was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, and therefore a future King of England. It would have been, by any conventional measure of dynastic advantage, an excellent match. Alix would have remained within the world she partly knew, and would have one day been Queen of England. But Alix, quietly and firmly, was not interested. She was 16 when the possibility was first raised, and she already knew, though she would not say so directly, that there was someone else, someone she had met 2 years before at a wedding in St. Petersburg, in a world very different from the English gardens of Osborne. In June of 1884, when Alix was 12 years old, she made the journey to St. Petersburg for the wedding of her elder sister Ella to Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia. Ella was 20 years old, and the match had been arranged between two families with long-standing connections. Sergei was the fifth son of Tsar Alexander II, and therefore a member of the innermost circle of Russian imperial power. The wedding was held at the Winter Palace, that vast and magnificent building on the banks of the Neva that served as the formal heart of the Romanov dynasty's public life. For a 12-year-old girl from Darmstadt, St. Petersburg, in the summer of 1884, must have been extraordinary. Nothing in the quiet Germany of her childhood had prepared her for the sheer scale of it. The width of the Neva, the endless golden facades of the palaces, the crowds and the ceremonies and the formality of a court that had been one of the grandest in Europe for more than a century. She had grown up in a household where her mother had deliberately kept things simple and domestic. She was arriving now in a world where simplicity was essentially unknown, where every surface was gilded and every occasion was governed by ritual. And somewhere in all of that ceremony, in the middle of the wedding celebrations, she encountered for the first time the Tsarevich, Nicholas Alexandrovich, the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, and therefore the heir to the Russian throne. He was 16 years old. She was 12. He noticed her. She noticed him. And something small and quiet began, in that gilded setting, that would take a decade to declare itself fully. Nicholas noted in his diary that he had been captivated by the young princess. The word he used was dreamlike, as if the encounter had left an impression that was not quite ordinary. For her part, Alix was too young and too new to the Russian world to have felt anything as defined as love. But she was old enough to register an impression, and she returned to Darmstadt carrying that impression with her, without knowing what it meant or what it would one day become. The years passed. Ella settled into her life in Russia, into the world of the Romanov court, where she was well received, and where she made the gradual social adjustments that any foreign princess had to make. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy eventually, not as a requirement of her marriage, since Sergei was not in the direct line of succession at the time, but as a personal and spiritual choice. This conversion would later be enormously significant when it came to her younger sister's own decision about her faith. Alix, back in Hesse, continued to grow up. Her father Louis IV was a steady presence, though he lacked the intellectual and emotional vitality that Princess Alice had brought to the household. He managed the duties of the Grand Duchy with reasonable competence, but he was, in the words of those who knew him, not quite the partner his wife had needed. The household was quieter now, and Alix navigated those quieter years with the self-sufficiency she had been developing since her mother's death. In 1889, when Alix was 17, she made a second visit to Russia, this time staying with Ella and Sergei for an extended period of 6 weeks in St. Petersburg. And it was during this visit that what had been a childhood impression became something altogether more serious. Nicholas, now 21, spent considerable time in the company of his uncle's young sister-in-law. He was attracted to her in a way that had clearly not diminished in the 5 years since their first meeting. If anything, the attraction had grown, nourished by occasional letters and by the image of a girl who had become, in his imagination, everything he wanted. And Alix, now old enough to understand what she was feeling, found that she had feelings of her own to reckon with. They were careful. The social conventions of the era required it, and neither of them was the kind of person who expressed themselves carelessly or publicly. But Nicholas wrote in his diary with increasing clarity about his feelings for Alix and his hope, which had by that point become something close to a certainty in his own heart, that she would one day be his wife. By 1891, he wrote that the dream had only grown stronger and more deeply felt since that visit of 1889, and that he could not imagine sharing his life with anyone else. The obstacles, however, were formidable. The most immediate was family. Alexander III, the Tsar of Russia, was a large and imposing man who combined genuine physical strength with a will to autocracy that had hardened during his reign into something close to inflexibility. He had no particular warmth for German princesses, and he had reservations about Alix specifically, partly because of the widespread suspicion, known among those in royal circles, that the Hesse family might be carriers of the hereditary blood condition that had appeared in Princess Alice's children. The Tsar and his wife, Empress Maria Feodorovna, who had been born Princess Dagmar of Denmark, and who had an attachment to her son that was fierce and proprietary, were united in their view that this match was not suitable for the future of the Romanov dynasty. Queen Victoria, watching from England, had her own reservations. She had always been uncomfortable about Russia, about its politics, its autocracy, its distance from the world she understood. She had personal misgivings about the Romanov court specifically, shaped by decades of political experience in which Russia had figured as an uncertain and sometimes hostile presence on the European stage, and she had very clear concerns about her granddaughter's safety in such an environment. She had seen enough of royal marriages to know that a princess sent to the court of St. Petersburg entered a world with its own laws and its own pressures, and that the road back, if things went wrong, was very long. So Alix found herself in an unusual position, genuinely in love with a man whom almost everyone around her was advising against, and held back not by lack of feeling, but by a religious scruple that was, for her, entirely sincere. Because if she were to marry Nicholas, she would be required to convert from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy. The heir to the Russian throne could not marry a woman who remained a Lutheran. The imperial bride had to embrace the faith of the empire she was entering, and for Alix, whose faith was not a form or a habit, but a genuine and deeply personal matter, this was not a trivial requirement. It was the most serious thing she had ever been asked to consider. The question of Alix's future had been a subject of quiet conversation within the various royal households of Europe for several years by the time the decisive moment arrived. Queen Victoria had continued to consider possible matches. The possibility of Albert Victor had come and gone. Alix had declined, and Albert Victor had since died of influenza in January of 1892, making the question academic. Nicholas had been informally discussed as a possibility in some circles, and informally opposed in others. The situation sat in the uncomfortable limbo that royal marriage negotiations so often inhabited, not resolved, not abandoned, simply present. In 1892, Alix's father Louis IV died. The succession to the Grand Duchy passed to her brother Ernst Ludwig, who became Grand Duke at the age of 23. Alix remained in Darmstadt, a princess now without the anchor of either parent. Her mother gone since 1878, her father gone now, in a household that was comfortable but without the family centre it had once had. And then, in the spring of 1894, events began to move with a speed that had not been seen before. Ernst Ludwig, now Grand Duke, was to be married to his first cousin, Princess Victoria Melita, of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a daughter of Queen Victoria's second son, Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. The wedding was to take place in Coburg in April, and it would bring together an extraordinary gathering of European royalty, with Queen Victoria herself attending. Nicholas was also coming, officially to represent his father at the wedding of Alex's brother. But Nicholas had obtained something more important than permission to attend. He had obtained his father's reluctant agreement that he might use the occasion to make a formal proposal to Alix. Tsar Alexander III was not well. His health had been declining, and those around him understood, even if the public did not, that his reign was likely approaching its end. The succession to the Russian throne was now pressing in a way that it hadn't been when Nicholas was a young man with years of time ahead of him. Alexander and his wife had finally, under that pressure, given their blessing, however grudging, for Nicholas to pursue the match with Alix, whatever their reservations about the German princess and her potential health complications. The alternative, a son and heir without a wife, was worse. So Nicholas arrived in Coburg in April of 1894, and within a day of his arrival, he had found a quiet moment with Alix and asked her to be his wife. She said no. It was not a coy refusal, not the kind of initial resistance that was sometimes a social formality in royal courtship. Alix meant it. She stood firm on the question of her faith. She had prayed about this. She had thought about it with the seriousness that every serious question deserved in her worldview, and she had not been able to arrive at a place where she could in good conscience abandon the faith she had been raised in. Lutheranism was not, for her, simply a label. It was the frame within which she had understood God since childhood, the tradition in which she had been baptized, in which she had found comfort after her mother's death, in which her inner life had grown and taken shape. To give it up felt, to her, like a kind of betrayal of something that she could not name precisely, but could feel absolutely. The pressure that followed was remarkable in its intensity. Every significant person in that wedding party, it seemed, took a moment to speak with Alix about the matter. Queen Victoria had a conversation with her granddaughter, a conversation in which the Queen, who in her own complicated way shared a version of Alix's concern about orthodoxy, nevertheless told her that the Russian Orthodox faith was really not so different from Lutheranism at its core, and that the requirements of dynastic duty had to be weighed alongside personal conviction. Her cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who was Nicholas's cousin as well, in the way that all these European royals were connected, spoke to her with the directness that was characteristic of him, and told her that it was her duty, quite simply, to marry the Tsarevich. But it was Ella who made the difference. Ella, who had herself converted to Russian Orthodoxy voluntarily, not as a requirement of her marriage to Sergei, but as a genuine spiritual choice, sat with her younger sister and talked to her about what the conversion actually meant, what it had felt like from the inside, what she had found in the Orthodox faith that she had not been looking for and had not expected. Ella was not the kind of person who treated faith as a matter of form. She had converted because she believed, and she told Alix so. She told her that a change of faith was not an enormous or unusual experience, that Orthodoxy and Lutheranism shared more than divided them, and that she had found in the Russian faith something that had nourished rather than replaced the spiritual life she had already had. The next morning, Alix accepted. Nicholas wrote in his diary that the day, the 20th of April, 1894, was one of the finest days of his life. He described the conversation they had, the tears on both their faces, and the particular quality of the happiness that followed, which he said was unlike anything he had previously felt. They were engaged, they were in love, and they had, at the age of 21 and 22 respectively, cleared the last formal obstacle between them. Queen Victoria, watching from across the room at various points during those extraordinary few days, is said to have been moved by what she observed, even if she was not without continued misgiving about the Russian future that awaited her favorite granddaughter. She photographed the couple together with the extended royal family. She gave her blessing, and she watched Alix closely with the particular attention of someone who understood that the course of a life had just been irreversibly set. Back in Russia, however, the timing of the engagement had immediately taken on a darker significance. Tsar Alexander III was no longer simply unwell. He was gravely ill, and the progress of his decline was becoming impossible to conceal. Nicholas was called home from Coburg with urgency. The wedding, which had been planned for the spring of 1895, was going to have to happen much sooner. On the 1st of November, 1894, Tsar Alexander III died at the Livadia Palace in Crimea, where he had been taken in the hope that the warmer climate might ease his condition. He was 49 years old. Nicholas, who was 26, became Tsar of all the Russias in the same moment, not in a ceremony, not with preparation, but in a sudden and irreversible fact. He reportedly said, in the immediate aftermath of his father's death, that he did not know how to rule, that he had not been prepared for this, that he did not feel ready. He was right on all three counts, but ready or not, he was now Nicholas II, Emperor of Russia, and Alix, his fiancée, was already on her way to Russia. Alix arrived in Russia under the most extraordinary of circumstances. She came not as a bride arriving for celebration, but as a fiancée arriving in the middle of a period of official mourning for the man who had, until days before, been the most powerful person in the empire she was about to enter. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy upon arrival, formally receiving the name by which she would be known for the rest of her life, Alexandra Feodorovna. The ceremony of conversion was a deeply personal moment for her. She had come to it after long inner struggle, and now that she had made her peace with the decision, she embraced the Orthodox faith not as a concession, but as a genuine commitment. The wedding that followed, on the 26th of November, 1894, was held at the Grand Church of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. It was a ceremony conducted in full imperial splendor. Alexandra, in a gown of silver and gold, the traditional dress of Russian imperial brides, with ermine at the hem and diamonds at her throat and wrists. Her cousin, Alexandra of Denmark, who was the Princess of Wales, and who had known the bride all her life, was said to have remarked that she looked too wonderfully lovely. And yet, the occasion itself was muted by the grief that still hung over the court and the family. It was, as one observer put it, more like a continuation of the funeral than the beginning of a life. There was something almost unbearable in that coincidence. This young woman, who had already lost so much, entering her new life in a country not her own, in a faith not yet fully her own, immediately after the death of the man who had been its sovereign. She would later say that she felt she had come to Russia only to be buried, first Alexander III, and then someday herself. That she said something like this even in the early days of her marriage tells us something important about her, about the fatalism that ran beneath the surface of her faith, about the way that loss had shaped not just her emotional life, but her fundamental sense of how the world worked. Nicholas, for his part, was entirely devoted, whatever else might be said about the last Tsar of Russia, and history has said a great deal. His love for his wife was real and consistent throughout their marriage. The letters they exchanged over the years, preserved and published after their deaths, reveal a relationship of genuine tenderness and intimacy, something rare in royal marriages of any era. Nicholas called her Sonny, her childhood nickname, which he had adopted and made his own. She called him Nicky. The warmth between them was not performance. It was the kind of love that two people build over years of genuine companionship, and it endured through everything that came after. The newly married couple did not move into the Winter Palace, as tradition might have suggested. Instead, they chose to make their primary home at Tsarskoe Selo, the imperial estate outside St. Petersburg, where the Alexander Palace stood in extensive parkland. It was smaller than the Winter Palace, more private, more suited to the kind of quiet domestic life that both Nicholas and Alexandra seemed to genuinely prefer. Nicholas's mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, retained her position of precedence in the court. Russian tradition held that the widow of the previous Tsar outranked the wife of the current one informal ceremonies. And so the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo became, in some sense, a retreat from that precedence, a place where Alexandra could be something other than the woman who came second. Alexandra found, from the very beginning, that Russia was not Hesse. The imperial court of St. Petersburg was a world of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary cruelty, governed by elaborate social hierarchies and sustained by the kind of gossip and intrigue that had no equivalent in the modest duchy she had come from. The aristocratic ladies of St. Petersburg society had their own ways of welcoming, or failing to welcome, a new empress. They had been accustomed to the dowager, who was warm and sociable, and who seemed to find the rituals of court life natural and even enjoyable. They found the new empress very different. Alexandra was shy. It was as simple and as complicated as that. The shyness she had carried since childhood, the quality that had deepened after her mother's death, that had made her withdraw into a smaller circle of trusted people, was interpreted by the Russian court as arrogance. She did not talk easily to people she did not know. She did not perform the social warmth that a court expected of its empress. She stood at the edges of balls rather than in their centres. She preferred a small gathering of close companions to a room full of formal acquaintances. And the court, unable or unwilling to look beneath the surface, decided that she was cold. She was not cold. She was lonely, and she was frightened, and she was trying to find her footing in a world that was nothing like anything she had been prepared for. But the impression, once formed, was very difficult to shift, and as the years passed, the gap between what Alexandra actually was and what the Russian aristocracy believed her to be would grow wider rather than narrower. The relationship between Alexandra and her mother-in-law was one of the defining tensions of the early years of the new reign. Maria Feodorovna had been a popular empress, and she had not retreated gracefully from the position. She continued to attend the major public occasions of the court, and the Russian rules of precedence required that Nicholas escort his mother into formal gatherings, a visible arrangement that placed the dowager beside the Tsar, while his wife followed at a distance. Alexandra, who was not a woman who suppressed her feelings entirely, found this arrangement humiliating. She did not say so publicly, but those close to her saw it clearly. Maria, for her part, was not actively cruel. She was simply a woman who had held the position of empress for 13 years, and who had deep reservations about her successor's temperament and suitability. She believed, and said to those she trusted, that Alex was too rigid, too withdrawn, too ill-suited for the performance of imperial authority that the role required. In this assessment, she was not entirely wrong. Alexandra's personality was genuinely ill-matched for the demands of public royal life, but the dowager's attitude did nothing to ease the transition, and the friction between them became a fixture of court life that everyone noticed and discussed. Beyond the specific tension with her mother-in-law, Alexandra was navigating a court that was in many respects alien to her on almost every level. The Russian aristocracy spoke French among themselves. It was the language of educated society across Europe. But in Russia, it had a particular density and exclusivity that made it a wall as much as a tongue. Alexandra spoke English and German with ease, and her French was adequate, and she was working on Russian. But the effort of conducting every social interaction in a language not entirely her own, among people who were watching for errors and weaknesses, was exhausting. And her Russian, when she eventually produced it, carried a strong foreign accent that never entirely disappeared, which was itself a source of comment from those who saw the Empress's every imperfection as evidence of something more sinister. She was also dealing with the physical demands of the role. The round of official entertainments that the imperial court required, the balls, the receptions, the formal dinners, the public appearances, were considerable, and Alexandra's constitution was not, it turned out, well suited to the relentless social performance they required. She suffered from what was then described as sciatica and heart trouble, complaints that would increase in frequency as the years of her reign passed, and that would eventually become severe enough to confine her to a wheelchair or a sofa for weeks at a time. Whether these conditions had a purely physical origin, or whether they were partly expressions of the anxiety and stress under which she lived, is a question that historians have discussed at length without arriving at a definitive answer. What is certain is that she was genuinely unwell with increasing frequency, and that the demands of public life made things worse rather than better. She retreated progressively from the grand occasions and the large gatherings, preferring the smaller world of Tsarskoe Selo. Her family, her closest companions, her faith, and her charity work. This retreat was interpreted by the court and eventually by the public as disdain, as indifference, as the attitude of a woman who thought herself too good for the people she was supposed to serve. The reality was rather different, but the reality was not visible from the outside. Through all of this, she was also navigating the most personal and pressing obligation of any imperial consort, the production of an heir. Russia needed a Tsarevich. The Romanov dynasty needed to be continued in the male line, and Alexandra, who had embraced the role of wife and mother with the whole of her warm and private heart, desperately wanted to give her husband the heir that the empire required. Her first child was born on the 15th of November, 1895. It was a daughter, Grand Duchess Olga. Nicholas, who genuinely loved his daughter, was gracious in public about the birth. Alexandra adored Olga, but the court and the broader political world had been hoping for a boy. Her second child, Grand Duchess Tatiana, arrived on the 10th of June, 1897. Again, a daughter. Again, the same quiet disappointment from those who were watching. Her third child, Grand Duchess Maria, came on the 26th of June, 1899. Her fourth child, Grand Duchess Anastasia, was born on the 18th of June, 1901. 4 daughters, 4 healthy, loved, wonderful daughters, but no son. And in the Russia of Nicholas II, in the Romanov imperial tradition, a Tsar without a male heir was a Tsar whose succession was uncertain. The dynasty would pass not to the daughters. The Romanov succession law explicitly excluded women from the throne, but to the nearest eligible male Romanov relative. The pressure on Alexandra was immense. It was a pressure that the court discussed openly, that her mother-in-law was not always tactful about, and that Alexandra herself felt with a particular acuteness given how seriously she took her obligations. She turned, as she had a tendency to do in moments of difficulty, to faith and to unconventional sources of spiritual guidance. There were reports of her visiting mystics and holy men in these years, seeking their counsel and their prayers for a son. In 1903, she suffered what appeared to be a false pregnancy, a condition known as pseudocyesis, in which the physical symptoms of pregnancy appear without there being an actual pregnancy. It was a painful episode, and one that suggested the degree to which the pressure of expectation had worked its way into her very body. And then, in 1904, after nearly 10 years of marriage, she gave birth to a son. Before we arrive at the birth of Alexei, we must go back to May of 1896, to the coronation that had taken place in Moscow, and to the event that accompanied it that became, in retrospect, one of the defining omens of the reign that would follow. the coronation of Nicholas II and Alexandra as Tsar and Empress of all the Russias was held on the 14th of May, 1896, in the Cathedral of the Assumption within the Kremlin in Moscow. It was a ceremony of extraordinary elaboration, rooted in centuries of tradition, combining the rituals of the Orthodox Church with the pomp of imperial power in a way that few other occasions in the world could match. Alexandra wore an imperial gown of extraordinary richness, encrusted with diamonds, trimmed with ermine, a garment that weighed heavily on the body, even as it shone magnificently in the candlelight of the cathedral. The ceremony lasted for hours, and when it was over, Nicholas and Alexandra emerged as the consecrated sovereigns of the largest empire on earth. The following day, as part of the public celebrations that surrounded the coronation, a great outdoor festival was arranged on the Khodynka field, a large open space on the edge of Moscow, about 5 miles outside the city centre. The tradition was that the Tsar would provide food and commemorative gifts for the ordinary people of Moscow: bread, sausage, sweets, and a small enamelled cup bearing the imperial monogram, which was to be a keepsake of the coronation. 500,000 people came, perhaps more. They came from the city and from the countryside, pressing into the field in the early hours of the morning to secure their place. And then a rumour ran through the crowd, a whisper, moving faster than truth, that the gifts were not enough, that those who did not get to the front would be left empty-handed. The crowd surged. In the ditches and trenches that had been left across the field from previous military exercises, people fell and were crushed. The pressure of bodies moving forward overwhelmed the capacity of those already there to hold their ground. By the time any order could be imposed, it was already too late. When the count was finally made, somewhere in the region of 1,000 to 1,400 people had died. Nicholas and Alexandra were stunned. Nicholas declared that he could not attend the ball that had been planned for that evening at the residence of the French ambassador, that to dance in the immediate aftermath of this tragedy was impossible. His uncles disagreed. The alliance with France was important, they argued, and to insult the French ambassador by cancelling the ball would be diplomatically damaging. Russia needed that alliance. Nicholas gave in, as he so often did when pressed by those around him. And so, the Tsar and his Empress attended the ball. The image of the new Tsar and his German wife dancing in the evening hours after hundreds of their subjects had died that morning was one that the Russian people did not forget. The court might have understood the diplomatic reasoning. The court might even have accepted it. But to those further from the gilded world of St. Petersburg, it looked like something simpler and uglier. It looked like indifference. And the label that began to attach itself to Alexandra in those early years, the cold German woman, the Tsaritsa who did not care, drew much of its early force from that terrible evening. To be fair to both of them, Nicholas and Alexandra were deeply distressed by Khodynka. Nicholas personally visited the injured in hospital, donated money for the families of the dead, and was reported to be genuinely shaken by what had happened. But history is not always fair, and symbols are not always accurate. The image of the ball outlasted the donations and the hospital visits, and the damage to their public standing was real and lasting. There were also, in those early years of the reign, other challenges that complicated the picture. Nicholas II was not, by nature or by training, well suited for the role that had been thrust upon him. His father had been an autocrat of genuine force and confidence, a man who held the enormous machinery of the Russian imperial state together through sheer personal will. Nicholas had been trained to be a Tsarevich, an heir, a future ruler, someone who would one day be ready, He had not been trained to be ready immediately. He was a kind and gentle man with a genuine personal warmth in small groups and private settings. He loved his wife and his children with a completeness that those who knew him closely found entirely sincere. He was a devoted father, patient, playful, present in ways that many royal fathers of his era were not. But at the center of the empire, something was missing that was impossible to replace with kindness. Russia, in the late 19th and early 20th century, was under enormous pressure. From poverty, from the beginning of industrialization, and all the social disruption that brought, from a growing revolutionary movement that was demanding change, from the enormous gap between the wealth at the top of society and the misery at the bottom. The Tsar of Russia in that era needed to be either a genuine reformer, capable of managing that pressure constructively, or a genuine autocrat capable of suppressing it by force. Nicholas II was neither. He was a gentle man trying to maintain an inherited position with tools that did not quite fit his hands. Alexandra, watching from close beside him, believed absolutely in the autocracy. She believed it not as a matter of pragmatic politics, but as a matter of divine order, as something God had established and that Nicholas was obligated to maintain. She saw his tendency to yield to pressure from advisors and family as weakness, and she urged him repeatedly in the privacy of their conversations and correspondence to be firmer, more decisive, more willing to stand on the authority that was his by birth and by God's will. Her faith was the foundation of this view, and it was entirely sincere. But the practical effect of her encouragement was to push Nicholas toward rigidity at exactly the moments when some flexibility might have served the dynasty better. On the 12th of August, 1904, Alexandra gave birth to her fifth child and the long-awaited male heir, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the boy who would in theory one day rule the Russian Empire. The celebrations were genuine and enormous. After 4 daughters and nearly 10 years of waiting, the dynasty had its heir. Nicholas was overjoyed. Alexandra was overcome. The little boy was healthy and beautiful, and for a few weeks, perhaps longer, it must have seemed that the pressure and the anxiety and the false start of the previous year had all been leading to this uncomplicated joy. Then they cut the umbilical cord, and the bleeding did not stop. Hemophilia is a disorder of the blood's ability to clot, an X-linked condition that passes from carrier mothers to affected sons, typically invisible in the women who carry it, and devastating in the boys who inherit it. It had entered the British royal family through Queen Victoria, who was herself a carrier, though the mutation appears to have been a spontaneous one. There was no known hemophilia in the generations before her, and it is believed that the condition arose in Victoria herself, possibly through a change in the genetic material she inherited from her father, who was 51 at her birth. From Victoria, it had passed to her daughter, Princess Alix, who was Alex's mother, and from Princess Alix, it had passed, without certainty and without visible symptom, to Alix herself. The specific type of hemophilia that appeared in the Romanov family was confirmed many decades later through DNA analysis of the family's remains. It was hemophilia B, also known as Christmas disease, the rarer and generally more severe form of the condition. At the time of Alexei's birth, none of this genetic architecture was understood in the precise terms we use now. What was understood, painfully and immediately, was that the little boy bled when he should not have bled, and that the bleeding was sometimes very difficult to stop, and that any internal bleeding, the kind that came from a bump or a fall, from bruising beneath the skin, could pool and expand and cause enormous pain and tissue damage without any visible wound to show for it. Alexandra understood within weeks of Alexei's birth that her son was ill with a condition that had taken her brother Fritti at the age of 2, and that had troubled her uncle Leopold, Queen Victoria's haemophiliac son. She understood that she had passed it to him. The knowledge settled on her with the particular weight of guilt that only a mother who has given her child an invisible wound can fully comprehend. She could not undo it. She could not cure it. She could only watch and pray and do everything in her power to protect this small boy from the world's hard edges. Nicholas and Alexandra made a decision that would have enormous consequences. They kept Alexei's condition secret. There were political and dynastic reasons for this. The Romanov succession depended on this boy, and to reveal that he suffered from a potentially fatal condition was to immediately raise questions about the future of the dynasty. But there were also simply personal reasons. They were protecting their child. They did not want him defined by his illness in the eyes of a court and a public that would watch him throughout his life. The secrecy, however, came at a cost, because those who watched Alexandra's behavior toward her son, the ferocious protectiveness, the refusal to allow certain activities, the anxiety that surrounded ordinary childhood, the prayers and the vigils during the episodes when Alexei was in crisis, could not see the reason for it. They saw an overprotective mother, perhaps a neurotic one. They did not see a woman watching her child's life hang by a thread that she could not quite grasp firmly enough. And then, around 1905 or 1906, a name entered Alexandra's life that would never leave it. Grigory Rasputin. Grigory Yefimovich. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant born in a village called Pokrovskoye in 1869. He had no formal religious education, no official ordination, no institutional standing within the Russian Orthodox Church. What he had was something that defied easy categorization, a quality of presence, of intensity, of apparent spiritual power that had attracted followers and alarmed critics in equal measure since he had arrived in St. Petersburg at the beginning of the century. He claimed to be a healer. He claimed to have the ability to communicate with God in a way that ordinary people could not. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that would define his relationship with the Romanov family, and eventually with Russian history, was that in the specific case of Alexei Nikolaevich, he seemed to work. The precise mechanism by which Rasputin appeared to help Alexei during his haemophilic episodes has been debated by historians and doctors ever since. The most widely accepted explanation among modern researchers involves the likelihood that the court physicians, in their efforts to manage Alexei's condition, were administering aspirin, which was at the time considered a general-purpose treatment for pain and inflammation, and which nobody yet understood, to dramatically worsen the bleeding of haemophilia patients by interfering with platelet function. Rasputin, arriving and insisting that the conventional treatment stop, may have inadvertently saved Alexei from the very treatments that were making him worse. There are also theories about hypnosis, about the calming effect that a confident and reassuring presence can have on the physiology of a child in pain. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was real enough that those who witnessed it could not dismiss it. Alexandra witnessed it. She was present during episodes when her son seemed to be dying, when the doctors were unable to stop the bleeding or the pain, and she watched Rasputin arrive, and she watched her son calm. She watched the crisis ease. She watched him sleep, and she made, in those moments, a connection that no argument or evidence would later be able to break. This man had saved her son. This man, whatever the court said about him, whatever the rumors and the scandals that attached themselves to him, was an instrument of God's mercy to her family. She never wavered from that conviction, not when the whispers about Rasputin's personal behavior reached her, not when members of the court and of the extended Romanov family came to Nicholas and to her personally to urge them to distance themselves from the holy man. Not when the newspapers began to print stories, not when the Prime Minister himself raised the matter. She heard all of it, and she dismissed all of it, because against all of it, she set the memory of her son's suffering and Rasputin's calming presence. And for her, that memory outweighed everything else. There has been much speculation over the years about the nature of Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin. Speculation that was at its most intense during her own lifetime, when the court and eventually the public were convinced that something improper was occurring. The evidence, examined carefully, does not support the more lurid versions of this story. Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin was spiritual in nature. She venerated him as a holy man, as someone through whom she believed God worked, and she communicated with him as a woman communicates with her confessor or her spiritual guide. She shared with him, in an unusual degree, her fears and her prayers and her anxieties. She relied on him in a way that was excessive and that had damaging consequences. But the nature of the reliance was religious rather than romantic. What it was, undeniably, was politically catastrophic, because Rasputin, for all his apparent spiritual gifts, was also a man of considerable vanity and ambition, who had found himself in a position of extraordinary proximity to the heart of imperial power, and who was not above using that proximity in ways that benefited himself and those around him. People who wanted appointments, who wanted decisions made in their favor, who wanted access to the Tsar, learned that Rasputin was a useful intermediary, and Rasputin, flattered by this and convinced of his own importance, accepted the role. He began to offer opinions on political matters. He began to recommend individuals for positions. He began, in short, to insert himself into the governance of the empire in ways that had nothing to do with healing or with prayer. Alexandra trusted his judgment on these matters. She believed that a man through whom God worked could be trusted on the question of who should serve as government minister, and the consequences of this belief would compound, in the years ahead, into one of the most destructive forces that ever acted on the already fragile Romanov dynasty. In the summer of 1914, the careful balance of European diplomacy, maintained with increasing difficulty for years through a web of alliances and counter-alliances, finally gave way. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in June set in motion a chain of consequences that drew, one by one, the great powers of Europe into a conflict that none of them had quite expected, and none of them fully understood. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, and the empire that Nicholas II had inherited found itself engaged in a conflict on a scale that almost no one had anticipated. For Alexandra, the outbreak of war produced a response that surprised many who had categorized her as cold and detached. She threw herself into the war effort with a completeness and an energy that was, by any measure, extraordinary. The woman who had struggled for years with her health, who had withdrawn progressively from the social obligations of the court, who had been criticized for her lack of visible public engagement, this woman, in the autumn of 1914, rose every morning at 7 o'clock, attended church, dressed herself in the grey uniform of a nursing sister, and went to work in the hospital that she had established at Tsarskoye Selo. She converted the Catherine Palace, one of the grandest buildings in the Imperial estate, into a military hospital. She completed a full course of nursing training and received her war nursing certificate. She worked alongside actual surgeons in the operating theatre, assisting with procedures, handling dressings and instruments, doing the physical and emotional work of wartime nursing without the distance that her rank might have allowed her to maintain. She took her two eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, into the work alongside her. By the end of 1914, she had personally sponsored and established 85 hospitals in the Petrograd area alone. Those who observed her in this work were sometimes astonished by what they saw. The woman who could not perform warmth in a ballroom performed something far more demanding. Genuine compassion in a surgical ward, with a naturalness and a steadiness that surprised even those who wished her well. She sat with dying men. She held their hands. She listened to them. She prayed over them. She wrote letters for those who could not write themselves. A newspaper correspondent, reporting in August of 1915, observed that the Empress appeared to have forgotten all her previous ailments and that the war seemed almost to have healed her, that she had devoted herself to the hospital work with a vigor and an absorption that transformed her. This was perhaps the Alexandra who might have been had the circumstances of her role allowed it, a remarkable public figure of genuine compassion and service. But circumstances did not allow it. The war brought with it pressures and complications that would eventually overwhelm everything else. The German connection was the most immediately damaging. Alexandra had been born in Germany. She had grown up in Hesse. She had German relatives. And Russia was now at war with Germany. The whispers that had always circulated about the foreign empress now acquired a new and uglier tone. She was not simply cold. She was not simply arrogant. She was, in the darkest version of the story that was being told in the salons of Petrograd and eventually in the popular press, a German spy, an enemy agent, a woman who was working to ensure that Russia lost the war in order to benefit her homeland. None of this was true. Alexandra was, if anything, fiercely pro-Russian. She had been fighting for years in private to be understood as Russian, to be accepted as Russian, to be seen not as a German princess but as the empress of the country she had chosen and to which she had given herself absolutely. Her nursing work was evidence of this. Her prayers for Russian soldiers were evidence of this. But evidence rarely wins against rumor in a time of crisis, and the accusation, however false, took hold and spread. In August of 1915, Nicholas II made a decision that would prove one of the most consequential errors of his reign. Against the advice of virtually everyone who counseled him, his ministers, his generals, members of his own family, and ultimately even his allies, he decided to leave Petrograd and travel to the front to take personal command of the Russian military forces engaged in the war. The decision came from a genuine place. Nicholas believed that the presence of the Tsar at the head of his army would boost morale and demonstrate his personal commitment to the fight. There was also, in the decision, a kind of pride, a determination not to be a sovereign who sent his men to fight while he remained in safety behind the palace walls. Alexandra, who had urged him repeatedly toward decisiveness and firmness, supported the move. She believed it was right. She believed it would show the world the strength of the Romanov commitment. But the practical consequences were disastrous. Nicholas's departure left the running of the domestic government in Alexandra's hands. She was not a government minister. She was not elected. She had no formal constitutional role in the governance of the empire beyond the informal influence she had always exercised on her husband. But in Nicholas's absence, she became the central point of contact between the government and the Tsar, relaying information, making recommendations, and increasingly making decisions that should have been the province of trained ministers and experienced politicians. And she made those decisions with Rasputin's counsel. The pace of ministerial dismissals accelerated dramatically in the months after Nicholas's departure. Ministers who were capable and experienced, men who had served the government with competence, were dismissed and replaced with individuals who had come to Alexandra's attention through Rasputin's endorsement. The process became so rapid and so clearly disconnected from any coherent governing logic that critics gave it a name: ministerial leapfrog. Those on the inside of the government who saw what was happening were alarmed. Those on the outside who had information about the pace of the changes were disturbed. And those who had no direct information, but who could see the consequences, in the deteriorating military situation, in the worsening supply shortages, in the growing food crisis in the cities, were becoming increasingly angry. The accusations of treachery intensified. Alexandra was referred to, in correspondence within the extended Romanov family, and eventually in wider circles, as the German woman who was destroying Russia from within. The accusation was false, but it was now being made not only by gossips, but by people who held serious positions, people who might otherwise have been the regime's natural supporters. Members of the Romanov family themselves wrote to Nicholas, begging him to return, to take back the reins of government, to remove Rasputin from the orbit of the court. He did not. In December of 1916, Rasputin was murdered. The conspiracy that killed him included, most prominently, Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, along with the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar. The killing was carried out with a thoroughness that suggested the depth of the conspirators' fear of what they were doing. Rasputin was poisoned, shot, and thrown into a river, and accounts of what happened in the basement of the Yusupov palace have been disputed and embellished ever since. What is certain is that he died on the 16th or 17th of December, 1916, and that his body was recovered from the Malaya Nevka River days later. Alexandra was devastated. She grieved for Rasputin with the completeness of someone who has lost not merely a friend, but a spiritual anchor, someone whose presence had been the guarantor, in her mind, of her son's survival and of the dynasty's continuation. She had him buried on the Imperial estate at Tsarskoye Selo. She wrote letters in which she described her sense of loss as almost unbearable, and she warned, in those same letters, that what had been done would bring terrible consequences for Russia. She was right, though not in the way she meant. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was the breaking point. The Russian Empire, stretched to its limits by 2.5 years of devastating war, was collapsing from within. Food shortages in the cities had become acute. Bread queues stretched around blocks in Petrograd, and families were going without. The army, having suffered losses that ran into millions, was running low on equipment, on ammunition, on confidence, and on any remaining loyalty to the system it was dying to defend. The temperature in the capital dropped to levels that made ordinary life nearly impossible. In February of 1917, by the old Russian calendar, which was 13 days behind the Western one, the streets of Petrograd began to fill with people who had decided, collectively and without any single plan, that they could no longer accept the world as it was. Strikes broke out, then demonstrations, then mutinies among the military units that were supposed to suppress the demonstrations, and within days, the machinery of the Imperial government, that vast and creaking mechanism that had governed the largest country on earth for centuries, had simply ceased to function. Nicholas, still at the front, received the news in dispatches that had been increasingly difficult to read with any clarity. He attempted to return to Petrograd. His train was diverted. He ended up at Pskov, surrounded by generals who had reached a conclusion that was unprecedented in Russian history, that the Tsar had to abdicate. They presented him with this conclusion not as a suggestion, but as a fact. On the 15th of March, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne of Russia for himself and, after seeking medical advice about Alexei's health, for his son as well. He attempted to pass the crown to his brother Grand Duke Michael. Michael declined it. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 304 years, was over. Alexandra was at Tsarskoye Selo when the news arrived. She had known for days that something was breaking, had known it in the way that people who are very close to the center of power sometimes know things before they are formally confirmed. She had been nursing her children, who were ill with measles at the time, and trying to maintain the routines of the household while the world outside the palace gates was being swept away. When Nicholas's abdication was confirmed, she did not collapse. She was too tired and too deep in her faith for that. She simply absorbed it and waited. Nicholas joined his family under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo in March. The provisional government that had replaced the Imperial regime was trying to manage the enormous task of governing Russia in the middle of a war. And for the time being, the former Tsar and his family remained in their familiar palace, surrounded by guards rather than courtiers, but still in the world they knew. King George V of England, who was Nicholas's first cousin, they had resembled each other so closely in person that stories circulated of their being mistaken for each other, initially offered asylum. There were discussions, and then the discussions were withdrawn. The British king, alarmed by his advisors' warnings about the Russian imperial family's profound unpopularity in Britain, and anxious about the effect that sheltering an autocrat might have on his own position, refused them refuge. It was a decision that George V himself would later regret. In August of 1917, with the political situation in Russia becoming more unstable by the month, the Kerensky government, the moderate provisional administration that had replaced the Tsar, moved Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children to Tobolsk in western Siberia. The move was presented as a precaution, a way of removing the former imperial family from the center of events, while the new political order tried to establish itself. The family was housed in the former governor's mansion in reasonable if diminished comfort. They attended church when they were permitted to. They taught the children their lessons. Nicholas cut wood in the garden. Alexandra prayed and sewed and wrote letters. Then the Bolsheviks came to power in October of 1917, and everything changed. The new Bolshevik government had no interest in reasonable accommodation. The former Tsar was, in their view, a symbol of everything they had come to destroy, and symbols needed to be dealt with decisively. In the spring of 1918, Nicholas and Alexandra were separated from their children temporarily. The children remained in Tobolsk, while their parents were taken to Yekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains in western Siberia. The children followed in May. The family was reunited in a house in Yekaterinburg that the local Bolshevik authorities had requisitioned and renamed with the blunt and chilling designation of the House of Special Purpose. They were confined there from the 30th of April, 1918. They occupied the upper floor, a small collection of rooms that became their entire world. The windows were painted over. They were permitted to exercise in the garden for a limited time each day, under guard. The guards were not selected for their gentleness, and the treatment of the family grew harsher as the months passed. Nicholas chopped wood. Alexandra, whose health had declined sharply, spent increasing hours in a wheelchair. She read, she prayed, she wrote in her diary. She wrote in those final weeks of faith, always faith, of trust in God's plan, of the certainty that whatever came would be according to His will and would eventually resolve in goodness, even if the resolution was not visible in this life. She was, by every account, the more composed of the two in those final months, or rather, the more anchored. Nicholas grieved the loss of his position and his country with a quiet, private depth that those who observed him could feel without him articulating it. Alexandra had found, in her faith, something that held her, even when everything external had fallen away. They were there for 78 days. In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, the commander of the guard, a man named Yakov Yurovsky, entered the room where the family's physician, Dr. Evgeny Botkin, was sitting awake. Botkin was told to wake the Imperial family and their remaining servants, 3 in number, and instruct them to dress and come downstairs. The reason given was that the family was to be moved again, that the advance of White Army forces in the region made it necessary to relocate them urgently. The family dressed. They came downstairs. They were led into the basement, a semi-underground room with a low ceiling and whitewashed walls, and told to wait while the vehicles that would transport them were prepared. Chairs were brought for Alexandra and for Alexei, who was not well enough to stand for long periods. They waited. And then Yurovsky returned, and he read from a paper, and before the full meaning of his words could be absorbed, the execution began. It lasted approximately 20 minutes. 11 people died in that basement room: Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, and 4 servants who had chosen to stay with them. The Bolsheviks initially announced only that Nicholas had died. The fate of the rest of the family was not confirmed for years. Alexandra Feodorovna, the last Empress of Russia, was 46 years old. The bodies of the Romanov family were taken from the Ipatiev house in the hours after the execution and transported to a forested area outside Yekaterinburg, where they were buried in a concealed location. The burial was deliberately hidden. The Bolsheviks wanted the matter finished without any possibility of the grave becoming a site of memorial or pilgrimage, and for more than 60 years the location remained unknown to the general public. It was not until 1979 that an amateur investigator named Alexander Avdonin and the filmmaker Gaily Ryabov located the probable burial site. Their discovery was kept secret during the Soviet period. To publish it would have been politically dangerous, and the Soviet state had little interest in revisiting the matter. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the investigation could proceed openly, and the site was officially excavated and the remains examined. The identification of the remains as those of the Romanov family was made through a combination of forensic analysis and DNA testing, comparing mitochondrial DNA from the remains with that of living maternal line relatives of both Nicholas and Alexandra. The results confirmed that the remains were those of the former Tsar and his family, and the DNA testing revealed something else of historical significance, that the haemophilia that had defined so much of Alexandra's life and so much of Alexei's suffering was specifically haemophilia B, the rarer and more severe form, different from what many had assumed. There was one further complication. The remains of 2 of the 7 children were not found in the original burial site. Alexei and one of his sisters, almost certainly Maria, though the question of which daughter was debated for some years, had been buried separately. Their remains were discovered in a secondary burial site in 2007, and subsequent DNA analysis confirmed their identities. This discovery, among other things, laid definitively to rest one of the most persistent myths to emerge from the execution, the story that one of the daughters had somehow survived. The mythology around the surviving Anastasia had been circulating since shortly after the execution itself, and it had generated numerous imposters and an enormous popular fascination. The DNA evidence was final. No one survived. On the 17th of July, 1998, exactly 80 years to the day after their deaths, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were interred at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of the Romanov emperors. The ceremony was attended by the then President of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, as well as by descendants of the Romanov family from across the world. Yeltsin gave a speech acknowledging the murder as a crime and expressing the hope that the burial would serve as an act of national reconciliation. 2 years later, in the summer of the year 2000, the Council of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church convened for its Jubilee Council, a major gathering held to mark the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Christ. Among the Shiyukab decisions made at that council was one of the most striking acts of historical reassessment of the modern era. The council canonized Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, and their 5 children as holy saints of the Russian Orthodox Church, specifically as passion bearers, a category of sainthood given to those who face death with Christian humility and meekness, following the model of Christ's own passion. Alexandra received the title by which she is now venerated in the Orthodox Church, Saint Alexandra, the Passion Bearer. The Russian Orthodox Church abroad had already taken this step in 1981, canonizing the family as new martyrs. The Moscow Patriarchate's decision in 2000 brought the Russian Church into alignment with a veneration that had been growing among Orthodox Christians for years. The church on blood was eventually built on the site of the Imperial house in Yekaterinburg, constructed directly over the spot where the family had been executed, and it became, in the years that followed, one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in Russia. What does it mean, at the end of a long and careful look at this life, to understand Alexandra Feodorovna? It means acknowledging the contradictions without trying to resolve them into something simpler than they are. She was a woman who was misunderstood by almost everyone who observed her from the outside, who was seen as cold when she was shy, as arrogant when she was frightened, as indifferent when she was overwhelmed. She was, by the consistent testimony of those who knew her closely, a woman of extraordinary warmth and depth of feeling within the circle she trusted. She was a devoted wife, in a marriage that was one of the genuinely loving royal partnerships in modern history. She was a devoted mother, whose fierceness in defending her children, and above all her son, shaped every controversial decision of her later years. She was also, by any honest accounting, deeply ill-suited for the role that history placed her in. The Russian Imperial court of the early 20th century required a performer, someone who could project warmth and authority to a crowd, who could navigate complex social dynamics with ease, who could be read as friendly and approachable by people she had never met. These things were simply not within Alexandra's range, and in the absence of the performance the role required, the interpretation that filled the vacuum was almost always negative. Her relationship with Rasputin, the most controversial aspect of her life by reputation, is best understood as the expression of a mother's terror given shape by a woman's faith. She was not foolish. She was not naive. She was a woman watching her only son's life hang in the balance, in an era when medicine had nothing to offer him, and she extended her faith to cover what her reason could not. This is not so different from what millions of parents across human history have done. What made it different was the political context, the fact that the person she trusted was himself embedded in a web of patronage and influence that eventually connected his spiritual guidance to the governance of an empire. She paid for all of it. She paid for her shyness, which was misread as contempt. She paid for her faith, which was misread as manipulation. She paid for her love for a man who could not quite govern the country he had inherited. And in the end, she paid with everything. In a basement in Yekaterinburg, in the early hours of a July morning, in the last year of the Great War that had broken the world she had known. But history has continued to reflect on her. the sainthood conferred in 2000, was not a rehabilitation engineered by politics. It was the recognition, within a tradition that knows something about suffering, that this woman had faced her death with a composure rooted in genuine faith, and that this mattered. She had gone down to that basement as a woman who believed she was going somewhere. Whatever we make of that belief, we cannot dismiss its force. She was born Alix in a summer nursery in Darmstadt in 1872. She was buried as Alexandra in a cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998, and she is remembered now as St. Alexandra the Passion Bearer, the last Empress of Russia, the British princess who became something that no one who knew the shy girl from Hesse could entirely have predicted. A fair woman whose story, more than a century after her death, still moves those who follow it from the very beginning. Thank you for spending this evening with Sleepy Crown Reborn. If this story moved you, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which chapter stayed with you most will help more people find their way to these stories. Sweet dreams.